The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Elspeth Fane would later reflect, entirely the wrong day for the collapse of a life. Tuesdays were for ledgers and laundry lists, for the quiet commerce of a household, moving through its rhythms without incident. They were not, by any reasonable accounting, days on which a man ought to dissolve a 7-year betrothal with 4 sentences written in a hand so unhurried it might have been composing a note about the weather. And yet the letter sat on the breakfast table with the terrible patience of something that had waited a long time to arrive. And when Elspeth unfolded it and read it once and then read it again, her cup of tea cooled at her elbow without her noticing, and the house around her went very quiet. The Duke of Ashmore, it read, was grateful for Miss Vane's many years of loyal understanding and found himself compelled by circumstances he was not at liberty to detail, to seek a union more commensurate with his station and his ambitions. He wished her every happiness and had, in token of his gratitude and genuine regard, arranged for the transfer of a property in her name. The estate at Thornfield Moor in the northern county of Westmark, comprising 412 acres of moorland and a house of moderate proportion, was henceforth hers in entirety and in perpetuity. He trusted she would find it a satisfactory provision. He remained, as ever, her most sincere and dutiful admirer. She read the line about the estate a 3rd time. She had been exchanged, it appeared, for a patch of wind-scraped moorland in a county she had never visited, near a town whose name she did not recognise, in a corner of England that even the mail coaches seemed to find inconvenient. She set the letter down with a care that was almost ceremonious. Then she folded her hands in her lap and sat for a very long time while the clock above the mantel ticked its indifferent way through the morning. Her mother came in at 9:30 and screamed, which was predictable. Her solicitor arrived at noon and explained, gently and at length, that the Thornfield estate was not precisely worthless, but that it was close enough to worthless that the distinction was largely academic. The soil was poor. The house had not been properly maintained in a decade. The workers who had once farmed the surrounding land had largely gone south to find better prospects, and what remained of the local economy was a thin and unconvincing thing. There was a wool merchant in the village, her solicitor said, clearly grasping for something encouraging, and he had heard there was quite a good church. Elspeth thanked him for his time. When he left, she went upstairs and stood at her bedroom window for a long while, watching the London street below, where the world moved in its usual purposeful way, entirely untroubled by her circumstances. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the shape of the life she had assumed was coming, its ballrooms and its Brussels lace, its seasonal migrations between town and country, its furniture of certainty. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and held it there until the chill moved through her hand and up her wrist and settled somewhere in the region of her chest. And then she allowed herself, for exactly the duration of one long, slow breath, to feel the full weight of what had been done to her. It was immense. It pressed against her sternum like something geological. Then she breathed out. She lifted her hand from the glass. She went downstairs and wrote 4 letters of her own. One to the estate's previous steward, one to the wool merchant in the village, one to a woman in Edinburgh whose name had been given her once by a friend, with the note that she was the cleverest person in Scotland and had been ruinously underused, and one to her own bank. She spent the evening reading everything she could find about the northern county of Westmark, about its geography and its climate and its history and its roads, until she could feel the shape of the place assembling in her mind like a map being drawn from the inside. She went to bed at midnight. She slept without difficulty. She left London on a Thursday morning in mid-October, which was at least a more appropriate day for a new beginning, with 2 trunks, a small and obstinate dog named Particular, who had adopted her during a walk in the park the previous spring, and a list of 23 things she intended to do when she arrived. The journey north took 3 days through country that grew progressively colder and wider and more indifferent to human ambition. And by the time the coach crested the last long ridge, and she looked out across the moor for the first time, a great grey-green expanse rolling away under a sky piled high with cloud, ancient and a little hostile, and entirely without vanity, she felt something that was not happiness exactly, but was adjacent to it in a way she could not yet name. The house was worse than she had expected. The West Wing's roof had developed opinions about its own architecture, opinions that were expressed in a creative variety of new angles. The kitchen garden had surrendered to something thorny and enthusiastic that had claimed the beds entirely. The front gates were open because the hinges had long since ceased to hold them shut, and they stood at an angle that suggested resignation rather than welcome. Particular stepped out of the travelling case onto the gravel drive, surveyed the scene, and then sneezed with what appeared to be editorial intent. Elspeth stood in the cold air and looked at the house for a full minute. Then she walked inside. There was, it turned out, a great deal to do. This was, she found, not a problem. To understand what Elspeth Vane did next, it is necessary to understand what she had been before the letter arrived, before the betrothal and the careful years of making herself suitable, before she had learned to arrange her opinions into palatable shapes and her ambitions into the narrow space a woman of her class was permitted to occupy without causing alarm. She had grown up in a house full of books, daughter of a man who had made his own fortune in trade and then spent it freely on education and travel, and the company of people who could argue well about interesting things. He had taught her mathematics the way another father might have taught a son, not as a curiosity, but as a tool, pressing the methods into her hands and trusting her to use them. He had taken her to see mills and markets and factories, pointing at the mechanisms with a kind of reverent practicality, saying, "Understand how things work. Everything works somehow. Learn the how of it, and you will never be entirely lost." He had died when she was 19, which was early, and she had mourned him in the thorough way that people mourn someone who was genuinely irreplaceable. What he had left her was not a great sum of money, but something harder to spend and slower to deplete. A way of looking at the world that treated every problem as a question awaiting its answer, and every apparent disaster as a set of conditions that had not yet been properly arranged. She had carried this with her through the years of her betrothal, like a secret she had not been invited to share, watching Ashmore's household move through its seasons of expense and display with the quiet, cataloguing attention of someone who already knew how it should have been run. She had never said so. She had arranged her face into appropriate expressions and bided her time, and been, by all observable measures, entirely content. The letter had ended that pretense with 4 sentences, and considerably less ceremony than she felt the occasion deserved. What it had done, though she would not have phrased it this way in the autumn she arrived at Thornfield, was give her back herself. The moor was empty and cold and astonishingly beautiful in a way that asked nothing of her, and the house was broken enough that fixing it required her full attention, and for the first time in 7 years, she went to sleep at night thinking about problems that were genuinely hers to solve. The first problem was money, which was to say the first problem was everything, since money was the precondition of all the other problems. She called on the wool merchant, a stout, sceptical man named Hodges, who had survived in a thin economy through a combination of stubbornness and low expectations, and sat across a table from him and asked questions for 2 hours with the unflinching thoroughness that had always made certain people deeply uneasy, and certain other people feel, for the first time in a long while, that they were being treated as useful. Hodges, she determined, was in the second category. He answered every question without condescension, and at the end of the meeting looked at her steadily and said, "You're not what I expected." She said, "I rarely am." They shook hands, which was not a thing women of her station customarily did, and she walked back to Thornfield through the November cold, feeling something she recognized after a moment as the particular warmth of having met someone she could work with. She hired workers from the village and from 2 towns over, people who had left the land because the land had offered them nothing, but who returned when offered a fair wage and a clear accounting of what was expected of them and what would be given in return. She was not soft about it. She was precise and consistent, and she kept every promise she made. And she did not make promises she could not keep. And this turned out to be its own kind of generosity in a place that had experienced more of the other sort. The roof was repaired through the winter by a crew who worked in 2-hour shifts against the cold and were given hot meals at midday and coal for their own hearths at week's end. The kitchen garden was reclaimed from its thorny occupant through a campaign that Elspeth herself participated in on 3 different Saturdays, arriving in work clothes that scandalized the housekeeper and delighted the gardeners. Particular supervised all of it from a series of strategic vantage points, occasionally inserting himself into a situation to be removed from it, generally ensuring that no one took anything too seriously. By February, the estate's accounts showed something they had not shown in over a decade, a direction of movement that was not downward. 7 miles south, in a house considerably more comfortable than Thornfield had been in October, a man named Caspar Aldred received a report from his factor with an expression of mild interest that did not shift as he read it, which was itself a kind of expression. Aldred ran the county's largest wool brokerage from this comfortable house and from offices in 3 other towns, and had for the past 15 years conducted his business in the manner of a man who operates beneath insufficient scrutiny. The Thornfield estate had been, until recently, a useful part of the local fabric. Its declining productivity had kept the regional supply of raw wool just low enough to justify the prices Aldred quoted, and its inefficiency had ensured that any excess output flowing through the county's markets passed through his hands on its way anywhere else. He had not arranged the estate's decline, he had simply noticed it was useful and had been careful not to intervene in its continuation. The report in his hand indicated that someone at Thornfield was doing something that was not declining. He read the figures again. He set the report down on his desk with no expression at all, which was, for those who knew him, a more informative response than most men's visible concern. Then he poured himself a glass of port and sat with it for a long moment in the chair by the fire, thinking with the patient, methodical attention of someone who had never made a rapid decision and did not intend to start. He would need to find out more about the new owner of Thornfield. He would need to understand the extent of her ambitions and the limits of her resources. And then, when he had both those things clearly in view, he would need to act in a way that was not visible as action, only as the gentle, impersonal movement of market conditions. He was very good at this. He had been doing it for a long time. What Aldred did not know, what no one in the county yet knew, because Elspeth had been careful about what she shared and with whom, was that she had not arrived at Thornfield simply to restore a neglected estate. She had arrived to understand it, and through it, to understand everything around it, including the invisible architecture of advantage that had kept the land poor while certain other parties remained comfortably prosperous. She had spent February not only repairing roofs and reclaiming gardens, but sitting with farmers who had worked the surrounding county for generations, asking the kind of unhurried, open-ended questions that people ask when they have no stake in the answer and so can be trusted with the truth. She had heard the name Aldred in 17 separate conversations. She had noted, without commenting on it, how the name arrived, not with anger, but with a particular flattening of effect, a careful neutrality that people adopt around things they have long since decided they cannot change. She had also, by March, found what she had come looking for. It was Hodges who found it first, or found it again. He had always suspected it existed, he told her, but had never had occasion or means to go looking. A bundle of correspondence dating back 12 years between Aldred's factor and the previous Thornfield steward, detailing a series of arrangements by which production records had been subtly altered, crop assessments quietly understated, sale prices reported to the estate's distant London owners at figures that differed materially from what had actually changed hands. The correspondence had been stored with the careless confidence of a man who did not expect to be found out, in a locked box in the estate's own outer barn, which Elspeth had put her workers to clearing in the second week of February. A young man named Tam, who was 14 and had an instinct for interesting things, had pried the lock with a tool he had invented for this purpose and brought the box to Elspeth, still smelling of cold earth and old wood. She had read the letters in a single evening. She had read them with the complete stillness of someone who is receiving information they have been expecting and are in no hurry to misunderstand. When she finished, she closed the bundle and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Particular came and put his chin on her knee and looked up at her with the expression he reserved for situations he deemed significant. She scratched behind his ears. She said quietly to the empty room, "Well then, now we know." Knowing was one thing. What to do with the knowing was a different and considerably more interesting question. She spent 3 days thinking about it before she did anything, which was longer than the situation seemed to require, and exactly long enough for her to be certain. She was not interested in a quick exposure that produced a brief scandal and then settled back into the usual arrangements. She was interested in something structural, something that would rearrange the conditions rather than simply punish one man within them. She wrote several letters. She made several journeys. She had several long conversations with people she had been quietly making friends with since October. People who had things to gain from a change in the county's commercial arrangements, and the patience and practical intelligence to help bring that change about. She also, in this period, met Lord Harwick. He arrived at Thornfield on a wet afternoon in March, on a horse that was considerably more composed than its rider, who appeared to have gotten the worse of a road dispute with the moorland weather, and was managing the aftermath with the slightly rigid dignity of a man unaccustomed to being dishevelled. His name was Lord Aldous Harwick, and he was the county's most senior magistrate. And he had come, he said, because he had heard things. He had been hearing things for several months, he added, carefully, in the manner of someone who is choosing their words with more attention than the occasion seems to require. Small things, inconsistencies largely. Questions about certain commercial arrangements that had always seemed to him, in his private capacity, somewhat difficult to account for. He had not known who to raise these questions with, and then he had begun to hear, from several sources, the name of the new owner of Thornfield, and had determined that the most direct approach was generally the best one. He was a tall man of 50 or so, with a face that had been weathered into something stronger than handsomeness, and eyes that moved with the trained, dispassionate attention of someone who had spent a long career reading the distance between what people said and what they meant. He sat in Elspeth's parlour, the roof now fully repaired, the room warmed by a fire that had learned its manners, and looked at her with an expression that was carefully free of assumption. She poured tea and set the letters on the table between them without preamble, and watched his face as he read. He read without comment until he finished. Then he sat for a moment with the bundle in his hands. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized because she had practiced it herself. the stillness of someone calibrating carefully before they act. He said, "How long have you had these?" She said, "Since February." He said, "And you have said nothing because—" She said, "Because there was more to understand first, and because I wanted to be certain of what I intended to do with them, and because I needed to know whether the county had a magistrate with the independence to act on what they showed, or whether that too was part of the arrangement." There was a pause. He looked at her steadily for a moment. He said, "Not as a question. You were determining whether you could trust me." She said, "Yes." He said, "And?" She said, "And you came here yourself, without writing first, on a wet afternoon when the road was poor, which tells me something." He considered this. Then he said, "It tells you I was in a hurry." She said, "It tells me you thought it might matter more than your comfort." He looked at the fire. He said, very quietly, "Yes, I suppose it does." Particular chose this moment to emerge from beneath the chaise and deposit himself between Lord Harwick's feet with the air of a small creature making a constitutional judgment. Harwick looked down at him with some surprise. Elspeth said, "That's particular. He makes assessments." Harwick said, "Does he?" She said, "He hasn't left your feet, which I take as a positive sign." Harwick looked at the dog for a moment, and then something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, but was the ancestor of one. He said, "I've never before been vetted by a terrier." She said, "There is a first time for most things." It was the closest either of them came to lightness that afternoon. What followed was 3 hours of careful, specific conversation that moved through the evidence and its implications with a methodical seriousness that Elspeth found, to her own mild surprise, genuinely satisfying. He was not dismissive and he was not patronizing, and when she made a point he did not understand, he asked her to explain it, rather than proceeding as though he had understood it. These were not remarkable qualities in a man, but they were rarer than they ought to have been, and she noticed them. He left at dusk, taking the letters and a full account of everything she had assembled. He did not promise more than he could give, which was that he would look at everything carefully and act on what he found. He said, "I want to be clear that this will not be rapid." She said, "I know." He said, "And you're willing to wait?" She said, "I've been waiting since October." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Longer than that, I think." She did not answer this, and he did not press it, and they shook hands at the door while rain fell quietly on the moorland behind him, and Particular watched from the threshold with an expression of careful satisfaction. The months that followed were not quiet, though from the outside they might have appeared so. Elspeth expanded the estate's operations through the spring and into summer with the purposeful accumulation of someone who understands that the most lasting forms of power are the ones that are built from the ground rather than inherited from above. She brought in a woman from Edinburgh, the clever woman she had written to in October, whose name was Margaret Seaton, who arrived on a May morning like a weather system and immediately began reorganizing everything she encountered without asking anyone's permission. And together they designed a cooperative structure through which the Thornfield Estate's wool would be processed and sold directly to southern buyers, cutting the brokers out entirely. It was not illegal. It was not aggressive, exactly. It was simply a different arrangement of the same conditions, an arrangement that happened to make Aldred's position in the county's wool trade substantially less central than it had been for the past 15 years. Seaton was a compact, sharp-tongued woman of 40, with the velocity of someone who had been underestimated by the wrong people for a very long time, and had arrived at a point in her life where she found this more useful than insulting. She and Elspeth understood each other within approximately 4 hours of meeting, and were arguing productively within 6, which was, they both independently recognized, the particular speed of compatible intelligences. She said, on the second day, surveying the kitchen garden with an expression that suggested she had immediate opinions about its current organization. "You know what you're building here is going to make enemies." Elspeth said, "It already has one." Seaton said, "I mean more than one." Elspeth said, "I know." Seaton said, "Good." She went back to her assessment of the kitchen garden with the air of someone who had established all necessary parameters and could now proceed. Aldred moved in July, which was later than Elspeth had expected, and not quite as she had anticipated. He did not confront her directly, because direct confrontation was not his method. Instead, he applied, through intermediaries whose role in his operations was by now clear to her, if not yet to the county at large, a set of pressures designed to slow her supply arrangements, to cast doubt on the quality of Thornfield's output among southern buyers, and to quietly discourage the workers she had hired from renewing their agreements at the season's end. He was good at this. She could see the craft of it, the way each pressure arrived from a different direction so that no single source was obvious. If she had been a different person, or a less prepared one, it might have worked. She was not a different person. She had been anticipating something like this since February. She had been building against it since March, and she had allies now who had skin in the outcome and the practical intelligence to act on it. When the supply pressures materialized, she had already secured 3 alternative routes. When the rumours reached the southern buyers, Seaton was already in London with evidence of the estate's actual output quality and the commercial relationships to make it stick. When the workers received their quiet discouragements, they came to Elspeth directly, and she matched whatever had been offered them, plus a small increment she described simply as loyalty rendered visible, and every one of them stayed. Aldred received a report in August that was worse than the one in February. He sat with it at his desk for a longer time than he had sat with the first one. There was something in the situation he did not yet fully understand, a shape to the opposition that was more organized and more patient than he was accustomed to encountering, and the not understanding of it produced in him a sensation he recognized as unusual and did not quite have a word for. He poured a glass of port and did not drink it. Then, in September, Lord Harwick moved. He did it quietly because the law tends to move quietly when it is working correctly. A set of accounts was examined. A factor was questioned with great courtesy and considerable thoroughness. 3 witnesses, whose identities remained private, provided testimony that corroborated the letters from the estate's outer barn. A formal inquiry was opened into commercial practices in the county's wool trade over the past 15 years, which was the kind of inquiry that, once opened, had a tendency to widen rather than contract. Aldred's solicitor arrived at the proceedings with a confidence that diminished visibly across the first morning and had essentially evaporated by noon. Elspeth was not present when Aldred finally read the full scope of what had been assembled against him. She had not arranged to be. She was at Thornfield in the kitchen garden, helping with the late harvest on a morning of thin autumn sunlight, and she learned what had happened through a note delivered by Harwick's messenger in the early afternoon. She read it standing in the garden with earth on her gloves. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, and looked across the moor for a while. The light on the heather was the colour of something almost warm. A hawk turned in a wide, unhurried circle far out above the ridge, and the sky behind it was the particular blue of very late September, clear and cold and very clean. She went inside for tea. Harwick came in October, 1 year and a few days after Elspeth had arrived at Thornfield, on a morning that was clear rather than wet, and the road was better than it had been, and he arrived composed rather than dishevelled, and brought with him a bottle of wine from his own cellar and no other pretense about the nature of the visit. She had put a fire on in the parlour, and Particular was already stationed in his position near the hearth, waiting with the patience of a creature who had been expecting this. Harwick came in and looked at the room, at the repaired ceiling and the warm walls, and the shelves of ledgers, and the window that now let in a good clean light without rattling in its frame. And something moved in his face that was not quite speechlessness, but was its dignified cousin. He said, "You've changed it considerably." She said, "I had considerable cause." He sat down across from her, and Particular migrated from the hearth to his feet with the quiet efficiency of an animal who has made this decision before. Harwick looked down at him. He said, "Still making assessments." She said, "He's decided you're reliable." He said, "High praise." She said, "From him it is." They talked for a long time about everything, and about nothing very specific, and about some things that were quite specific indeed, moving through the afternoon with the ease of two people who have each survived something and come through on the same side of it. The wine was very good. The fire burned down slowly and was rebuilt. Outside, the moor turned through its afternoon colours from amber to grey to the deep, saturated blue of early evening, and the light in the room grew warm and close and companionable. At some point, Elspeth said, not looking at him, watching the fire, "I didn't come here expecting any of this." She meant the estate's recovery. She meant, possibly, more than that. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What did you come expecting?" She said, "To survive it." A silence. He said, "And instead?" She looked at the fire. She said, "And instead, I seem to have built something." He said, "Yes." He said it simply, without elaboration, and she understood that the simplicity was the point, that he was one of those rare people who trust the plainness of a true thing not to need embellishment. She looked at him then. He looked back. Between them, Particular lifted his head and looked at each of them in turn, and then put his chin back on Harwick's boot with an air of finalized judgment. A year passed after that, and then another, and the changes that had begun in October at a neglected house on a cold moor had by then moved outward in the way that genuine changes tend to do, not explosively but steadily, reshaping the ground as they went. The cooperative structure that Elspeth and Seaton had built became a model. Not immediately and not without resistance, because models rarely travel easily, but eventually in 3 other counties, in conversations that began with someone saying, "I heard about a woman in Westmark who did a thing that seemed impossible and turned out not to be." Seaton, who had arrived for a month and stayed for 3 years, published a pamphlet on fair trading structures that was read by people who did not entirely agree with it, but could not, on examination, refute it, which was in her view the most satisfying form of influence. Aldred's inquiry ended in findings that were not flattering to him. He did not go to prison, because the law of the time was not constructed to make that easy, but he was substantially diminished, which was its own kind of consequence. His brokerage contracted. His reputation preceded him in ways that proved commercially inconvenient. He retired eventually to a smaller property in a different county and was not much heard from afterward, which was perhaps the most fitting resolution available. Not destruction, which would have been dramatic, but irrelevance, which was simply true. Thornfield grew. Not extravagantly. Elspeth had no interest in extravagance, but solidly, in the way that things grow when they are cared for with genuine attention, and when the conditions around them are finally honest. The West Wing's roof held through 3 winters without complaint. The kitchen garden became a source of some local renown, and in one memorable season, an argument between Seaton and the head gardener that produced, as its unlikely resolution, an arrangement of raised beds that neither of them had envisioned and both of them claimed. The workers stayed, and their children grew up on the estate. And when they were old enough, some of them found other work, and some of them did not. And both outcomes were acceptable because they were genuine. On a morning in November, 2 years after the letter that had started it all, Elspeth stood at the window of what had become her favourite room. The one with the repaired ceiling and the new light and the view across the moor toward the far ridge. And watched the weather come in from the north, the way weather always came in from the north up here, without apology and without haste. A long grey curtain of it moving across the heather. Particular was at her feet. Harwick was somewhere behind her, doing something with the papers on her desk, with the comfortable authority of a man who has learned that certain spaces are shared ones, and this is not a problem, but a fact. She could hear the small sounds of his presence, the turn of a page, the faint clink of his pen being set down. And these sounds were, she realized with a clarity that was not quite surprise but was near enough to it, among the most ordinary and welcome things she could think of. She watched the weather come. She thought about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday. She thought about the cold glass and the long breath and the 4 letters she had written in response, and the coach north through the widening country, and particular sneezing on the drive, and the house waiting in its broken state to be made into something. She thought about the 12 years of letters in the locked box, and Hodges looking at her steadily over the table, and Harwick on his well-composed horse in the rain, and Seaton reorganizing the kitchen garden with the velocity of an unchecked force of nature. She thought about all the mornings she had gotten up knowing what needed to be done and done it, and all the evenings she had gone to sleep knowing the accounts were moving in the right direction, and the roof was holding, and the workers would come back in the morning. Outside, the first rain reached the window. It came softly, the way it often came here, without drama, simply present. Behind her, Harwick said, quietly, "It's coming in fast today." She said, "It always does from the north." A pause. He said, "Do you mind it?" She thought about this for a moment. She looked at the moor, dark now under the cloud, the heather losing its colour to the weather, the ridge invisible, the whole wide expanse of it going grey and close and intimate. She thought about the woman she had been on the morning a letter arrived on a Tuesday, pressing her palm to cold glass, letting herself feel the weight of everything only for the duration of one long breath. She thought about what she had built on the other side of that breath. She said, "No." She said it simply, the way he had said yes, trusting the plainness of it to carry what it needed to carry. And she turned from the window into the warm room, where the fire was going and the accounts were ordered and the dog was awake, and everything that mattered was present and accounted for, and the rain fell on Thornfield the way it always had and always would, indifferent and honest and entirely without malice. The same rain falling on the moor as on a repaired roof, on a kitchen garden in its 3rd good year, on a hawk turning in a slow, unhurried circle above the ridge, making its patient survey of a ground that had been, against every expectation, made worth surveying. There is a thing that happens to certain estates when the right person arrives in them, a thing that cannot be planned or predicted, but can be recognized in retrospect as having been, all along, the thing that was waiting to happen. The moor around Thornfield had not changed. The soil was still poor in its lower acres. The winds still came without manners off the ridge. The village still had the modest, self-sufficient character of places that have learned to expect nothing extravagant from the world, and to neither complain about nor celebrate this fact. What had changed was something less visible and more consequential. The sense that the land and its people were being attended to by someone who understood that attention is not the same as sentiment. That genuine care has a practical dimension, and the practical dimension is what makes it last. Elspeth had not set out to be loved by the county. She had set out to understand it and to be useful to it, and had discovered, as people sometimes do when they are honest about their intentions, that these two things together produce a third thing they had not been seeking. By the time the summer of her second year arrived, she was spoken of in the village and in the farms and in the market town 12 miles east, not as the newcomer from London, not as the woman who had been discarded by a duke, though everyone knew this and had their own feelings about it, but simply as Miss Vane of Thornfield, which was a designation that carried in it something that functioned, in the local vocabulary, as a form of belonging. This was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. She had been careful not to let it soften her in ways that would make her less effective, and careful also not to let it leave her in the ways that it could sometimes feel, briefly, on cold evenings when the accounts were particularly complicated, and the north wind was expressing itself at some volume through the gaps she had not yet gotten to. Not entirely unlike comfort, not entirely unlike what belonging might feel like if you were encountering it for the first time, and were not quite sure you were allowed to keep it. The hawk that had circled over the ridge on the September afternoon of Harwick's note had come back. Not the same hawk, she understood, or perhaps the same one. She had no way to know and had decided not to pursue the question, because some things are more useful held lightly. It appeared on mornings when the weather was clear enough to hunt, a dark shape moving in the high light above the heather, riding the thermals with the complete economy of a creature that does nothing without reason. Particular noticed it first every time, his nose lifting, his small body going very still in a way that Elspeth had come to read as a kind of salute. She had taken to watching for it on difficult mornings, not superstitiously, she told herself, but because the sight of something moving with that much competence and that little apparent effort was, in its way, instructive. She thought about it on the morning she received a second letter from the Duke of Ashmore. This one arrived with a symmetry she could only have described as unwelcome on a Tuesday. She saw the seal before she read the name and felt a flicker of something that was not quite the old pain, but was in its vicinity, the way a healed bone will register cold weather. She opened it at her desk with the accounts spread before her, which seemed appropriate, and read it with the same still attention she had given the first one, though the circumstances between the two readings were so different that they might almost have been happening to different women. Ashmore had heard things, the letter said. A man of his connections heard a great deal, and what he had been hearing for the past year had given him cause, he wrote, for reflection of a kind he had not anticipated. He expressed regret, the elaborate, careful kind that occupies a great deal of space on a page, while conveying relatively little by way of actual feeling, and indicated that he found himself in a position of wishing to revisit certain past understandings, if Miss Vane were amenable and if circumstances permitted. He had heard, he could not help but note, that she had done remarkable things in Westmark. He thought, quite often, that he had perhaps not properly appreciated. He remained, as ever, her most sincere. She read it to the end. Then she set it down and looked at it for a moment, the way she might look at a ledger entry that did not correspond to any transaction she recognized, with interest, with patience, and with no particular feeling. She had, she realized, no anger left for him. She had used it all up on the cold October morning when she had written 4 letters in response to his 4 sentences. And what had burned in her then had been transformed, across the months that followed, into something she valued considerably more than anger, which was the estate itself, and the cooperative, and Seaton arguing about raised beds, and particulars assessments, and Harwick's steady eyes reading letters by firelight. She did not write back. This was not, she decided, a decision she needed to examine. Some doors, when they close behind you, are doors you have no reason to open again, not because of bitterness, which is a form of continuation, but because you have simply walked far enough in another direction that the door is no longer on your route. She put the letter in the small box she kept for correspondence she had received and would not answer, of which there had been, in her life, several interesting examples. Then she went out to the kitchen garden, where Seaton was doing something architectural with the late summer herbs that appeared to involve principles Elspeth had not previously associated with horticulture. And they argued pleasantly about it for the better part of an hour, and the day moved forward into itself. She told Harwick about the letter that evening, not because it required his opinion, but because they had reached the point in their understanding of each other where withholding an interesting piece of information felt more like effort than sharing it. He listened without expression, and then was quiet for a moment, and then said, "What did you feel reading it?" She thought about this honestly. She said, "Nothing I hadn't already finished with." He nodded slowly. He said, "Good." She said, "You were expecting me to say something more dramatic." He said carefully, "I was prepared for several possibilities." She looked at him. She said, "And now?" He said, "Now I think you're exactly where you thought you were." She said, "Which is?" He said, "On the other side of it." The fire made its small sounds. Particular, between them, shifted and resettled with the purposeful comfort of an animal that has found the precise geometric center of an ideal situation and intends to remain in it. She said after a while, "Do you know what I miss from before?" He waited. She said, "Nothing specifically. I miss the shape of it sometimes, the shape of having something settled." He said, "And now you've settled something else." She said, "Yes, but I settled it myself, which is different." He said, "Different how?" She looked at the fire. She said, "It fits." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Yes." Just that. Yes. The way he said things that were simply true. This was what she had not known to look for in the years when she had been arranging herself into the shape of someone else's future. She had not known that there was a kind of conversation that did not require management, that moved without the small, constant effort of a person monitoring how they were being received and adjusting accordingly. She had not known because she had not had occasion to compare. She had it now, and the comparison, when it arrived, was quiet and absolute, the way the most definitive things tend to be. Not a revelation, but a recognition. Something she understood not because it was new, but because she was finally in the right position to see it clearly. Outside, the moor held its dark. The autumn was returning. There was smoke from the chimneys in the village, and in the farmhouses on the far side of the ridge, and from Thornfield itself, rising straight in the still night air, a thin and patient signal that something lived here, that warmth was being maintained against the cold, that the house and the land and the people in it had, through effort and honesty, and the willingness to begin on a broken October morning, with 4 letters and a very small dog, made themselves into something that could endure. Everything grows, Elspeth thought, when it is no longer alone. She had read that somewhere once, or perhaps she had heard it, or perhaps she had simply arrived at it herself through the accumulated evidence of the past 2 years, which were, when she considered them, the most genuinely hers of any years she had lived. She held the thought. She let it settle. She did not say it aloud, because it was the kind of thing that does not need to be said aloud to the right person in the right room. It is simply known. It simply is. There was a moment, later recorded in the testimony of 3 separate witnesses who had each independently noticed it, when Caspar Aldred understood what had happened to him. It came not in the magistrate's chambers, not when the accounts were laid before the examining board, but in the village market on an unremarkable morning in late September, when a wool farmer named Jenks, who had sold to Aldred's brokerage for 11 consecutive years without complaint, because complaint had seemed until recently beside the point, turned away from him mid-sentence and walked to the other side of the square to speak with a woman from the Thornfield Cooperative about prices for the winter clip. Aldred stood where Jenks had left him. He was not a man who had ever stood unattended in the middle of a market square. He looked at Jenks's back. He looked at the square, at the other farmers and merchants and workers, and he understood with a sudden and complete clarity that the invisible thing he had built over 15 years, the subtle web of obligation and dependency and carefully calibrated scarcity that had made him the necessary centre of the county's trade, was no longer there. It had been rebuilt around something else. Someone else had arranged the conditions, slowly and honestly and without announcement, and the county had moved into the new arrangement the way water moves, not because it was forced, but because the new shape was simply lower, simply easier, simply more true. He had not been destroyed. He had been, which was worse, simply made unnecessary. He walked to his horse. He rode south. Behind him, the market moved on without interruption, because markets are practical things and do not pause to mark departures, and the square filled with the ordinary noise of people conducting the commerce of their lives in conditions that were, for the first time in a considerable while, genuinely fair. The hawk was hunting that morning, far above the ridge. It turned in its long, patient circles and did not concern itself with what moved below, only with what was real, only with what was there.